Hello again. Now, South Africa's public discourse in the early years of democracy focused a lot on nation building. The late Archbishop Desmond Tutu coined the concept of a rainbow nation as the country navigated a path among nations post-apartheid. Now, let's discuss this further now with the Chief of Staff at the African Union Development Agency, Dr. Msingathi Sipuka, who recently penned a personal view, a personal opinion about reconceptualizing South Africa's idea of nationhood. Doc, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your time. I read your opinion piece and I was really fascinated about the points you were touching on about our nationhood, about nation building. And you make a point, and that's where I want to start, in the middle of your article. Towards the end, in fact, you say the idea of nationhood and the South African nation has become even more complex than when we started on this journey post-apartheid during the nation-building efforts in 1994. Why has it become more complex?
No, thanks very much for inviting me and to expand the discussion on the opinion piece. So fundamentally, I think the argument that I make is that in 1994, I think the protagonists within the concept of nation building were relatively clear. We were dealing with an immediate post-apartheid society, and our society was really structured around the oppressor and the oppressed. And in the South African context, we could characterize that into predominantly white society and predominantly black society that had historically evolved within the context of a South African history. I don't think questions of immigration, questions of new entrants into the South African landscape had taken root in the way that they have post-1994 as a function of the opening up of the country, of our economy and its relative advanced status in the continent. So all of these issues have come to a head. We are now sitting as probably certainly in the continent as the country that takes in the most migrants in the developing world, one of the countries that take on the most migrants into our geographical space. And that, I think, it changes the dynamic in terms of who then become the players on how we conceptualize and build this idea of a South African nation. I think over and above that, which is something that we did not touch on in the article, is that there's been a less homogeneous effect on black society as well, with the advancement of the 30 years in terms of the development of the economy, the building of the black middle class, the building up of the black bourgeoisie, and really most of our people still remaining within the confines of the poverty that they were confronted in with pre-1994. So those are some of the dynamics around reconceptualization.
So immigration has impacted our migration, or immigration has impacted our nation-building effort?
I think the point that we make is that migration in the South African context happens without us as the South African nation being able to define what is the national project or what is the South African nation and the associated project that moves with it. So people who come into the country are unable to assimilate into anything coherent for them to be able to move with. And the point that we make is, for example, if you become a migrant within the U.S. economy, there is a very definitive and distinct nation orientation of U.S. economy. So as much as you may take your character of Mexicans living in the U.S., but fundamentally you are assimilated into something which gives credence to how immigrants or migrants who come into a particular country integrate and assimilate into what the national interest is. And the problem in South Africa is that as the primary protagonists between black and white, we have been unable to find one another in a systematic way that is able to define the national interest, the South African project, and anyone who comes into the country comes into something that is defined and moves with that project. So that is fundamentally the argument that we are making.
Yeah, you make a very interesting point. I mean, as you conclude, to say we now have to reconceptualize the idea of nationhood. I'm quoting you there, and what is a South African nation, and that we need a national conversation that will go beyond this historical protagonist, that will go beyond the black and white binary, as you say. Now, I know you are proposing a national conversation around it, but what are your thoughts? What could such a reconceptualization look like? I'm sure you've given it some thought.
No, certainly. Certainly. I think the basic premise that we move on in the opinion piece is fundamentally a question of integration of people who come and settle into South Africa. And I think the question that we look, there are spurts on an occasional basis that show us that we have been unable to systematically integrate people who come into South Africa in a way that builds them into this thing. So what does integration look like? And I think at the core of it, I think it's a political issue. It's something that needs to happen at the level of our communities, but it is something that needs to be led. It's not something that's going to inherently happen on itself. That is one piece. So we need the political leadership really to speak about integration beyond the black and white integration in South Africa, looking at it from the lens of migration. That's number one. But number two, the economy. I think the questions that bring out the most contradictions in our society, particularly between South Africans and migrants, is the economy. So how we are able to transform the economy in a way that creates space for nationals is critical in how we facilitate that integration as well, and perhaps deal with some of the conflicts that we see on a regular basis.
Dr. Msingathi Sipuka, of course, in his personal capacity, having written about this important discussion, but his job, of course, is that of a Chief of Staff at the African Union Development Agency. Thank you very much for your personal reflections there about the nation-building effort in our country. 30 years into our democracy, we're still battling with it.